Hi everyone, and thank you for not running for the buses. So today we're going to talk about walking down the serverless staircase, a socio-technical framework for adopting serverless inside of organizations. I'm Ben, as I mentioned. I'm the CTO of a company called aleios, which is a consultancy that helps companies adopting serverless. So not only have I adopted serverless inside of product companies, I've done it repeatedly, so I've seen the successes and failures and can share some of the things that have gone well and the things that have gone less well. I'm also the editor of the Serverless Transformation blog, so a lot of the work we do you can find and read there, and that's all open source. And I'm also an AWS serverless hero, so I get to speak at events like this. I help run the serverless meetup in London and work with AWS on some of their event-driven services. So today we're going to look at the serverless-first utopia, so what are we aiming towards? And this is really going to build on a lot of what the other talks today have gone over. We're then going to hear a cautionary tale of a transformation to serverless that didn't succeed. Then we're going to look at the serverless staircase as a set of lessons that are repeatable to avoid those mistakes. And then finally, the conclusions. And I would like to preface this with the fact that we're all at different stages of this journey. Organizations, or a lot of organizations, have seen the benefits of cloud and started moving that way. And some are going fully into serverless to get the full benefits. But existing legacy technology and organizational challenges can make this difficult. And this is what we're going to talk about today. One more thing before I jump in. David actually asked all the speakers, what's the one thing you'd go back and tell yourself before your serverless journey? And actually, I've done this repeatedly for lots of different organizations. And I think the common theme across these is to focus not on the technology alone, the technology is super important, but to focus on the people challenge. And we're going to come to that a bit later, but that's one of the keys to succeed and something I think as engineers we can often overlook. So, the serverless-first utopia, what are we trying to get? We've covered a lot of this today already, but lower total cost of ownership, higher ability to scale, faster development, and an easier or greater capability to experiment with what we're building. Putting it into numbers, the IDC study is really interesting, but that shows things like 60% reduction in operational costs for large organizations, 71% reduction in unplanned outages, which typically translates to quite a lot of lost revenue. And my favorite as an engineer is the increase in developer productivity. And the study's at the bottom if you want to read through it, it's really interesting. One other thing I'd suggest you read, and I promise David did not make me put this in, is the value flywheel. When we talk about a serverless utopia, that's got a number of real case studies with real numbers and real stories about how organizations have adopted serverless and what they got at the other end. So if you want to understand more about that, and it's actually really useful if you're trying to build your business case for moving to serverless, it's definitely a great read. But moving on to the cautionary tale. So there was an organization, a large-scale e-commerce, that was transacting billions of euros per year with a legacy monolith built by a number of outsourced providers, so not a lot of in-house knowledge on how it was all working. It was all on-premise and supported by a large infrastructure team with only whole system deployments possible. So typically this ended up with a big change approval board and a long process to get anything out to production. Pages were taking several seconds to load, and they were having large downtime events quite often. But the CTO was an evangelist for serverless. He'd come to conferences like this and understood the value he could get from moving to serverless and wanted to leapfrog to go to fully serverless from on-premise, so not even go through the containers routes. But he needed a plan to get there. Now, moving from on-premise through to fully serverless is possible. Moving a huge monolith and refactoring it in one big go to be fully serverless, we're going to see is not so possible. And the approach to do this, that this organization had, was to have the existing team to continue. Let's not disrupt that. They can keep building features. And a new team was going to be spun up of experts in the new technology to rebuild the system, with one day a big bang transformation happening, turning the old system off, switching the new system on. If anyone's tried to do this, you probably know where the next slides are going. The existing team was left unchanged, and a new team was brought in to build the new system. Yes, experts in the new technology, but not experts in the domain that they were building. And it led to two organizational structures that were actually competing, which wasn't super healthy. So this ended up in the people who'd been brought in not being experts in the business, so not necessarily building things with all the features that they needed. The existing team felt super threatened by this team because they didn't see where they were going to be after the Big Bang happened. So they actually started actively sabotaging this. No assumptions were tested. No culture of continuous delivery was built. If we're trying to move to serverless to get a higher deployment frequency, if through the actual move to serverless we're not achieving that, it's quite hard to change culture. No value was shown to stakeholders, which didn't create a lot of support. The team was super demotivated. I could keep going on. But really, a lot of the poor design decisions of the existing system were just being wholesale repeated into the new one. Now, I'm going to caveat this that I was joining to help with some domain-driven design workshops midway through and started looking around at what was going on and started to get a bit panicked. And what was happening was just successive modernization programs being started and being stopped. Several senior leadership team members resigned, or that was the story. No value was actually getting shipped to customers, and code was getting thrown away, which is super painful. And finally, that relationship between the technology team and the product team was getting really damaged by the successive transformations that weren't succeeding. And that's multi-million pounds investment, or euro investment, going completely down the drain. And one of the big things they fell into is the field of dreams trap. If you build it, they will come. This is true. This is not true for users. If you build it, they're not necessarily going to come. But also, it's not true for engineering teams. If you're going to go build your new shiny system, it doesn't matter how nice your landing zones are, your platform team, and your documentation, they're not instantly going to adopt it and feel part of the change unless you involve them from the start. So what did I have to do? Well, I was a consultant jumping into one part of the system to help for a few weeks. Typically, I work in bigger projects with teams, but here it was just me on my own. Looking around, I was getting really worried by the chaos, the politics, and just people were generally unhappy. So I spoke to the CTO, and we used our sort of common interest in serverless to build trust. And he agreed, but unfortunately, I was the one put into this room, facing his board to say, basically, you spent 5 million euros on this project, you're not getting anything, you need to start again. Nothing can be reused. And if we don't, well, we're going to have a similar conversation in 6 months about 10 million euros, so we can do this now or do it later. And they agreed, but this time, why was it going to be different? And this is where we get to the Serverless Staircase. What's going to be different this time? And this is not only from this program, but from many programs I've been involved in and people I've spoken to, the common lessons and common pitfalls. How can we address them proactively when starting to adopt serverless in an organization of any size? So we're going to go through a number of steps, 1 to 5, and for each step we're going to talk about that vision, but also what are the tools and techniques to actually achieve it pragmatically. The first one, and I think a few of the talks today have gone over this, is having a good clarity of vision. This is having sponsorship at the executive level and having a really key understanding of the return on investment on what we're building, and having KPIs that are not just tracked after the switch is flicked at the end of a big bang transformation, but that's tracked throughout to actually create tangible value to teams, create motivation, and actually create buy-in from the rest of the organization. For this step, there are 2 key tools. One sounds super obvious, having a business case to actually move to serverless. But having a business case is one thing. Have a business case that has clear ROIs, that has metrics, and is actually communicated across teams is a different one. And these are often kept at the top level and not distributed. But by distributing it, you don't only motivate your engineers who are actually building the serverless system, you create buy-in from the other organizations to actually support this program. The other one is having clear KPIs. Having them for the overall sort of return on investment for the transformation is great, but having things that teams can measure as they build is also key. Being in production is a great way to measure these, but even before then you can use things like Google Lighthouse scores to show the performance of the new site compared to the old site, and other ones to actually pull that value forwards and make sure assumptions are being tested and what's actually going to be delivered. Step 2 is the topology. So this is the structure. It's great to have a domain-driven design-based architecture that's event-driven, that's completely independently deployable, but we also need the organizational structure that can go along with this. And I know we've spoken about team topologies already today. But really building to reduce that cognitive load and making sure we have a platform team that can help support teams to work effectively is key. And this needs to be a living document, needs to be clearly communicated, and needs to be something that the team actually understands the wider context of. 2 tools that are really useful here. One is event storming, which we've talked about already today, or event bridge storming, which takes it a bit further to use Amazon Event Bridge and build an event schema that's a living document. But this is bringing together the business and the technical functions, or the product and the technical functions, which, yes, should be one function, and getting them to put the different business events that happen, start to figure out the different boundaries in the system, figure out the independent services, and deciding on the event schema. And that event schema and event-driven architecture is the contract between those teams. So no longer do we have the synchronous connection between different teams, but when we move to serverless at scale and in an event-driven paradigm, that event structure is a schema. That needs to be versioned, that needs to be living, and there has to be code bindings that teams can actually go and use. The second part is the cloud team topology. That's making sure that we have a platform team that is supporting those streamlined teams. If you've not read Team Topologies, it's a really good book which talks about different operations of teams. But in a more tangential sense, in serverless, one of the key things I've done in organizations I've worked with and many other people have done is use CDK to build packaged constructs. This is a really useful way for us to build in defaults, sensible defaults, encapsulate things that shouldn't be changed, and build composable constructs that can be used by different streamlined teams. This can be everything from a Lambda function that has some sensible defaults or an S3 bucket that can't be made public, through to having common use cases for REST APIs and WebSocket subscriptions. Step 3 is training. So this is making sure that we create a path for people in the existing organization to move along with us. Now, psychological safety is key, and one way to do that is to actually show people where they're going to sit in the new organization, something that's often overlooked. But we also need to have that clarity of vision. We need to use pair programming. Courses are great, certifications are amazing, but there's nothing like pair programming with somebody who already knows the technology. And finally, we need to measure and track progress at an individual team and organization level to make adjustments if things aren't working, but also show the wider organization the progress that we're making. A really useful tool here is a skills matrix, so breaking down all the tools, technologies, and services that a particular team needs, and then tracking those on a weekly or sprint basis with a coach and sort of coachee relationship, rating 0, meaning I've got no idea at all, through to 4, I could teach it confidently. And you can actually build quite interesting maps of each team, their skill set, and as an organization, their skill sets. And that can then lead you to target programming with an expert in one team who's amazing at DynamoDB single table design, and somebody in another team who needs to sort of improve in that area, and it helps you plan that sort of into training, but also see wider gaps in the organization and bring training in as needed. Step 4 is what I'm calling MVM, but having a progressive migration strategy. We need to avoid the big bang at all costs. Because we don't test anything, and typically they don't go very well, they also don't give value to customers, and they create a lot of politics internally with product organizations that don't see this transformation as actually helping them. So minimum viable migrations is a framework that I've presented in other talks, but it's a framework to adopt a strangle of fig style migration to serverless. And making sure you use things like edge routing, eventification, and micro front ends to avoid big bang at any cost. If you're thinking of a big bang migration, feel free to talk to me afterwards. Avoid it at all costs. We really need to pull risk forwards, show value early, and actually test our assumptions. And minimum viable migrations, if you're interested, it's all open source, and you can find it on the aleios website there. I'm sure the slides are being shared afterwards. But with all of that, the thing that brings it together is not the most exciting word that we use, is governance. But governance is key to create accountability and to show the organization cares about this program. One of the key things to getting governance right is making sure it's not purely a function of the technology department, but also the product department, and trying to move those organizations as close together as possible. A key tool here is what I call the Cloud Digital Delivery Office. It builds on, McKinsey have a model of the DDO, the Digital Delivery Office, but having something that's co-owned by the product organization and the technical organization at the highest levels. So potentially, I've seen this with the CTO and the Chief Revenue Officer co-owning a team that spans across teams, having product and technology leaders inside of that, and being able to resolve dependencies between teams, have a more agile approach to resourcing, but also create accountability on the transformation-wide KPIs, which the DDO itself is accountable for, and also at the team level, creating accountability, visibility, and also praise when things are going right. So putting that all together, it starts with having that really clear clarity of vision, then building the right topology, both in the organization and in the technology and the architecture that we're building. Training needs to create a clear path for people in the organization that exists through to where they're going to be, creating training plans, creating coaching relationships, and using things like the skills matrix to track progress through that. We need to avoid that big bang at all costs, and a progressive migration strategy like MVMs is great, and strangle fig approach in general. And finally, having the right governance, and having that governance not just purely be a function of technology, but also of the product organization. In conclusion, organizations are moving to serverless to realize the full benefits of the cloud, reduce total cost of ownership and time to value, and do read the value flywheel to understand more about how organizations are doing that. The people challenges are just as important as the tech challenges, and we want to avoid that field of dreams trap at all costs. Avoiding that big bang approach is key, and the MVM is a framework to do that. There are common lessons across transformations, and I think the more people who are moving to serverless, we always talk about the things that go really well, but the more we share about the things that don't go so well, we can start to address those sort of common challenges across transformation projects. And if you get it right and you adopt a progressive approach, the rewards are there. And actually, in that organization I mentioned before, once they restarted their transformation based off these principles, the tech and product organization actually decided to share headcount and merge together, which was a huge step. They went to production in 8 weeks, and they could actually show business value early on. And there was a huge change. People who were completely against serverless inside of the organization, maybe members of the infrastructure team, suddenly were doing their cloud practitioner exam and trying to get as involved as possible in pair programming with the developers. So if you do set people up for success, they do want to build great stuff, you just have to make sure you get that stuff right at the start. If you want to hear more about minimum viable migrations, I've got a white paper on it. Grab me, I can share it with you. And the Serverless Staircase we've built out as a full website that's completely open source, so we'll share that as well. That's on the website. I think it's going out tomorrow if I do some coding tonight. And you can click through all the steps and the tools there. That's everything. I've been Ben. If you have any questions, I think some of us might be going to a pub later, and I'll be around afterwards. You can also reach me on Twitter. And just once again, thank you to David and his team for an amazing conference.